In a room filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses, the unthinkable happened. A man, respected, admired, raised his hand and struck his black wife in front of everyone. The sound of that slap was louder than the music, louder than the laughter, but what followed was even louder: silence. No one defended her. No one stood beside her. Except for one pair of eyes, a little girl's, watching, remembering. Years later, that girl grew into a woman. And in front of those same people, she finally spoke. And when she did, the room went so still, it felt like the walls themselves were listening. What did she say that broke the silence of years? You'll find out. But first, tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments below. And if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this story will leave you breathless. The laughter was still hanging in the air when it happened. The clinking of glasses, the shuffle of polished shoes on the hardwood floor, the sound of a family gathered to celebrate an anniversary dinner that was supposed to mark 20 years of love and endurance. People had traveled from near and far, dressed in their finest, eager to be part of the memory. And in the center of it all stood Monica Harris, elegant, warm, her presence commanding without effort. She was the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, the kind of woman people looked up to without always saying it out loud. But in that instant, the dignity she'd built over years was stripped away. Richard Collins, her husband, tall and broad with that self-satisfied grin he wore like armor, snapped at her over something small. Too small. A serving mistake. A comment he thought sounded too bold. No one would even remember what triggered it. What they would remember was his hand. The way it came across her face, fast, brutal, unhesitating. The crack echoed louder than the clinking glasses ever could. The room froze. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Conversations halted mid-sentence. And Monica didn't cry. She didn't stumble. She stood there, her cheek burning, her breath caught somewhere between pride and humiliation. Every eye turned to Richard. Some widened in shock, some dropped quickly to their plates. A few guests whispered, but no one moved. Not one person stood between him and her. Not one voice rose to say, "Enough." Because Richard Collins was not just any man. He was wealthy, respected in business, the kind of man whose handshake opened doors. People feared crossing him. They feared losing his favor. And so they pretended not to see what they had just seen. They hid behind their champagne glasses, their polite smiles, their cowardice. But there was one pair of eyes that didn't look away. In the corner of the room sat Amelia Collins, their daughter, just old enough to understand too much. She clutched the edge of her chair, her knuckles white, her wide brown eyes fixed on her mother. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She saw. And though she was silent, though she couldn't yet find words big enough to match what had just happened, the moment carved itself into her memory like stone. For Monica, the humiliation wasn't just in the sting of her husband's hand. It was in the silence that followed. It was in the way people shifted uncomfortably but carried on, like nothing had happened. She felt small, invisible, even as she stood in plain sight. And she knew, this wasn't about anger, or discipline, or a drunken mistake. This was about control. Richard had wanted to remind everyone who held the power in that room. And worse, he wanted to remind her. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the silence of that night would not last forever. Monica's shame, her quiet endurance, her daughter's unblinking witness, all of it was planting something. Something that would grow, slowly, silently, until the day it was ready to erupt. That night, the celebration continued. The music started again, laughter forced its way back into the air, and Richard charmed the room like nothing had happened. But beneath it all, something had shifted. And in the eyes of one little girl, a fire had been lit that no one, not even Richard Collins, could ever put out. After that night, nothing in Monica Harris's life was ever the same. Outwardly, the world kept spinning as if the slap had never happened. Richard Collins returned to his routines. Business meetings, golf weekends, his impeccable suits pressed sharp enough to cut glass. To the outside world, he was still the polished man everyone envied. And the family portrait hanging above the fireplace still showed a smiling couple with their little girl. But behind the closed doors of their pristine home, silence became Monica's constant companion. She never spoke about that evening again. Not to Richard, not to friends, not even to Amelia. Yet the bruise on her face faded far quicker than the bruise on her spirit. She carried herself with the same poise, cooked meals, hosted dinners, attended church on Sundays.
But inside, she was shrinking.
Every time Richard raised his voice, she flinched. Every time he mocked her in subtle ways, she swallowed the words that rose to her lips.
She stayed, for Amelia. Monica had grown up knowing what it meant to fight alone.
She knew what it was like to live with very little, to scrape and stretch and bend until you felt you would break.
She didn't want that for her daughter.
Richard's wealth meant Amelia had a good school, nice clothes, opportunities Monica had never dreamed of for herself. And so Monica endured, trading her pride for Amelia's future.
But children see more than parents realize.
Amelia never forgot the sight of her mother standing frozen in that room, her cheek stinging from her father's hand. She noticed the way her mother's smile sometimes didn't quite reach her eyes. She heard the sharp edge in her father's tone, the way he spoke to Monica like she was a shadow. And though Monica told her daughter bedtime stories, kissed her forehead, and whispered that everything was fine, Amelia knew it wasn't. Some nights, Monica would sit on the edge of her bed, and Amelia would press her small hand into her mother's palm. "One day, Mom," she whispered, "it won't be like this. I promise." Monica would smile, though her heart ached. She knew Amelia's words came from love, but what power could a child have against a man like Richard Collins? Still, those whispers carried Monica through countless lonely nights. As Amelia grew older, the weight of silence grew heavier. She became her mother's shadow, watching, learning, absorbing. At school, she excelled quietly, keeping her head down but her eyes sharp. At home, she measured her father carefully, studying his habits, his weaknesses, the cracks in his flawless armor. Richard believed Amelia was like her mother, gentle, pliant, someone he could dismiss without consequence.
He never saw the steel forming beneath her soft exterior.
He never realized that each insult, each moment of cruelty he inflicted on Monica, was forging something powerful in his daughter. Years passed this way. Monica endured, Amelia observed, and Richard thrived in his arrogance.
But storms don't stay silent forever. Clouds gather. Pressure builds.
And one day, the silence snaps. The night it happened, Richard once again put Monica in the center of a crowded room, mocking her, belittling her as others laughed uneasily. He thought he was untouchable, that no one would dare challenge him.
But this time, someone did. And for the first time, it wasn't Monica. It was Amelia.
Amelia was no longer the wide-eyed little girl who had watched her mother's humiliation in silence. She had grown into a young woman, tall, poised, with the kind of presence that didn't scream for attention but commanded it when she chose to speak. She carried her mother's grace, but behind her eyes lived a sharpness Richard never noticed. To him, Amelia was a child he could brush aside, someone who would eventually grow to admire him as others did.
But Amelia wasn't blind.
Years of watching her mother shrink into silence had carved something permanent into her heart. Every insult, every command disguised as love, every smirk Richard wore when Monica lowered her gaze. Amelia remembered it all. And though she rarely confronted him, she was studying him, quietly measuring the arrogance that dripped from his every word. The gathering storm came on a night much like the one that had started it all. The Collins family home was once again filled with guests, the air thick with perfume and the chatter of polite society.
Richard thrived in settings like this.
He was the host, the entertainer, the man everyone admired, at least to his face. He liked reminding people of his influence, liked reminding Monica of her place. This time, it wasn't a slap.
He had grown more calculated.
Instead, he ridiculed Monica's voice in front of everyone. She had made a gentle suggestion about the evening's seating arrangement, and Richard pounced. "See? This is why I handle the important things," he laughed, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Monica would have us dining like school children in a cafeteria if I let her decide." The laughter that followed wasn't genuine, it was brittle, awkward, forced.
But it was enough. Monica's face flushed. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer. She never did.
But Amelia felt the same heat rise in her chest that she had carried since childhood. She could feel her heart hammering as she watched her father dismiss her mother's dignity with a single cruel joke. For years, she had held her tongue, honoring her mother's silence. But this time, her restraint broke. She stood. At first, no one noticed. Amelia rarely drew attention to herself, and in a room full of adults, her voice had always been softer. But when she spoke, there was no softness in her tone. "Do you ever get tired, Dad?" she said, her words slicing through the hum of conversation. "Tired of being the only one laughing at your jokes?"
The room went still. Forks clinked softly against plates as heads turned.
Richard froze, his smile faltering as his daughter's words landed heavier than he could have anticipated.
Amelia didn't sit back down.
Her eyes locked on her father's, unflinching. For the first time, Monica looked up and saw not a girl, but a woman standing in her place.
Richard tried to laugh it off.
Now, Amelia, don't be dramatic. But Amelia cut him off, her voice louder now, steady, resolute. Do you remember the night you hit Mom?
In front of all these people?
I do. I was a child, and I remember every second of it.
And do you know what's worse?
I remember how nobody said a word.
Gasps rippled through the crowd.
The walls that had kept the family's secrets contained for years suddenly cracked open. Monica's breath caught in her throat, her hand trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. Richard's face drained of color. The man who had always believed his power was absolute had not expected this. He had underestimated the daughter who had been watching him all along. The storm had broken. The silence was gone. And nothing in that room would ever be the same again.
The air thickened.
It was as if Amelia's words had sucked the oxygen out of the room. The clinking of cutlery, the shallow laughter, the endless background noise of small talk, all of it died at once. For the first time in his life, Richard Collins was not the loudest voice in the room. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Every eye was on Amelia now. The same guests who had pretended not to see the slap years ago, the same ones who chose comfort over courage, were staring at her with a mix of shock, shame, and uneasy recognition.
It was as though Amelia's words had dragged their own guilt into the light.
I was a child, Amelia continued, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly at her sides.
And you hit her.
Right here, where everyone could see.
And not a single person said anything. Not one. You all laughed. You all ate your food.
You all let her stand there with her dignity broken while you protected his image.
The silence cut deep.
Guests shifted in their chairs, their gazes falling to their laps. The clinking of a wine glass being set down was the only sound.
Richard's face hardened.
He tried to regain his footing, to summon the arrogance that had always shielded him. You don't understand, Amelia. You are a child.
Amelia's eyes flashed.
I understood enough. I understood that my mother's pain didn't matter to you. That your pride, your image, meant more than her dignity. I understood that you wanted me to grow up believing that silence was safer than truth.
Monica's chest rose and fell rapidly.
She had never seen her daughter like this, so fierce, so unafraid. For years, Monica had swallowed her own fire, burying it under layers of endurance. But now, watching Amelia, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades: hope. Richard's hand slammed against the table. The sound jolted some of the guests, but Amelia didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her voice sharp enough to cut through his thunder. You think power is in your voice, Dad? It's not. It's in ours, the voices you tried to silence. Mom's voice. My voice. And tonight, you don't get to laugh it off. Tonight, the truth gets told.
The room was no longer Richard's. It was Amelia's.
Some of the guests exchanged uneasy glances. A few nodded subtly, as though silently admitting they had been wrong all those years ago. Others looked toward Monica, as if realizing for the first time the depth of her suffering. Monica's eyes glistened with tears she had buried for too long. She wasn't crying from shame this time. She was crying because her daughter had done what she never could. Amelia had ripped open the silence and forced the world to see Richard for what he was.
And Richard?
For once, he looked small. The arrogance that had carried him for years faltered under the weight of truth. His shoulders slumped, his jaw tightened, but there was no laughter left in him.
No would he come back. No charm to hide behind.
Amelia's words hung heavy in the air, unshakable, undeniable.
And the room went still.
For years, Richard Collins had been untouchable. He was the man with the sharp suit, the confident handshake, the one who spoke louder than everyone else and drowned out the truth with charm. But on that night, as his daughter's words echoed through the room, the illusion cracked. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of complicity anymore, it was the silence of reckoning. Every guest present could feel it. The image of Richard as the respected husband, the powerful host, the untouchable man of influence, was collapsing right in front of them. Amelia didn't waver. She looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over every pair of eyes that had witnessed her mother's humiliation years ago. You all let it happen, she said, her tone quieter now but heavy with weight. You let him humiliate her, You let him strip her dignity, and you laughed because it was easier than standing up.
But not tonight.
Tonight, you all see him for what he is.
Monica's breath caught.
She felt a trembling in her chest, a release she hadn't known she'd been waiting for. Years of endurance, years of silence, suddenly they weren't heavy chains anymore.
Her daughter had picked up the weight and shattered it.
Richard tried to rise, tried to reclaim control. Enough, Amelia.
Sit down.
You don't know what you're saying. But Amelia didn't move. Her lips curled into the faintest, sharpest smile.
No, Dad.
I know exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying it because Mom deserves more than your shadow.
She deserves her voice back. The words landed like a blow.
Guests who had once avoided Monica's eyes now turned to her, as though really seeing her for the first time. A woman who had borne the storm with quiet strength, who had carried herself with grace even while being broken down. And suddenly, the shame no longer belonged to her, it belonged to Richard. Monica stood slowly. Her legs trembled, but Amelia's hand was there, steady and sure. For years, Monica had dreamed of speaking up, but the words had always withered before reaching her lips. Now, with her daughter beside her, the words finally came. I stayed quiet because I thought it would protect us, she said softly, her voice cracking. I thought silence would shield Amelia, that it would give her the chance at a future I never had. But silence doesn't protect anyone, it only protects men like you. Gasps spread across the room. Richard's mask shattered further, his face turning red with rage and embarrassment. He wanted to strike back with words, but his voice caught in his throat. And then the shift happened. A murmur started among the guests. Someone stood and muttered, "He's not the man we thought."
Another shook their head.
The tide was turning, one whisper at a time. Richard Collins, the man who had always thrived on his image, was watching it burn before his eyes. He had built his power on silence, and now silence was the one thing the room denied him. Monica and Amelia stood together, side by side, no longer shadows in his orbit but the center of the room's truth. For Richard, there was no coming back from this. His laughter, his arrogance, his carefully crafted image, it was all ashes now.
And for Monica, it was more than revenge. It was freedom.
The night that had begun with laughter and cruelty ended in a silence that belonged to Monica and Amelia. The guests filed out slowly, their conversations hushed, their eyes avoiding Richard as though his presence was now a stain on the very air. The man who once commanded every room with arrogance was left standing alone, his shoulders sagging, his face pale with the realization that power built on fear collapses the moment courage enters the room. But the true victory wasn't in his downfall.
It wasn't what came after.
For the first time in decades, Monica didn't feel like a prisoner in her own life. She wasn't just a wife defined by her husband's shadow, she was a woman who had survived, who had endured, and who had finally been seen. The years of humiliation no longer weighed her down, because Amelia had lifted that burden into the light. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Richard sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand though it was barely 9 o'clock. He muttered excuses to himself, tried to rewrite the narrative in his own head. They'll forget.
They always do.
But deep down, he knew they wouldn't. His image was gone, his authority dismantled by his own daughter's truth. And for the first time, Richard Collins looked like what he really was, small, fragile, and powerless. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Monica and Amelia shared breakfast together. There was no heavy silence, no hidden pain lurking in Monica's eyes. Instead, there was a quiet strength between them, a bond that had only grown stronger through the storm. Amelia reached for her mother's hand, and Monica held it firmly, her grip no longer trembling. "You were so brave," Monica whispered. "Braver than I ever was." Amelia shook her head, her voice calm but unyielding. "You were the brave one, Mom.
You stayed when it was hard. You carried me through it."
I just gave the silence back to him. Tears filled Monica's eyes, but these were not tears of shame. They were tears of release, of pride, of gratitude. Word spread quickly. Families talk, communities remember, and in hushed conversations around dinner tables, the truth of Richard Collins was retold again and again. The man who once silenced others was now defined by the silence that followed him everywhere. Doors closed to him, allies turned their backs, respect evaporated like mist in the sun. For Monica and Amelia, life didn't become magically easy.
But it became theirs. Monica no longer felt the need to bow her head or hold her tongue.
She spoke, she laughed, she reclaimed parts of herself she thought she had lost forever. And Amelia, though still young, became a symbol of courage to those who whispered about their own silent suffering. The final victory wasn't in Richard's ruin, it was in Monica and Amelia's freedom. And as they walked out of that house together one evening, the setting sun casting long golden shadows across the street, Monica felt lighter than she ever had. Her daughter's hand was in hers, firm, steady, unafraid. The revenge was complete, not in the way Richard would have imagined, with shouting or fists, but in the quiet, undeniable justice of truth. And the lesson was clear, not just to them, but to everyone who heard their story. Silence protects the abuser, but truth redeems the abused. Every time you like, share, and subscribe, you give us the strength to uncover and tell more stories that the world often tries to keep silent. Real voices, real struggles, real victories. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone stay silent when they should have spoken up? Or maybe, were you the one who finally found the courage to speak? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading them. Your support doesn't just grow this channel, it helps us keep telling stories that deserve to be heard.